London is wrapped in fog, and where others see chaos, he finds the truth. The legendary detective Sherlock Holmes is back in the game. Welcome to the channel. Put on your headphones and unravel new mysteries alongside him. It was a cold and listless evening in early March when I found myself once more in the familiar sitting room of 221B Baker Street. The lamps had just been lit, casting their amber glow upon the shelves and papers that cluttered the table, where my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, sat absorbed in study. A soft hiss came from the kettle on the hob, and the faint murmur of the city beyond the fog-muted window drifted up from Baker Street like a sigh from a restless sleeper. Holmes had been uncommonly silent for much of the day. He had spent the afternoon bent over a peculiar contrivance of wires, a glass rod, and a small battery which he regarded with the reverence of an alchemist before a crucible. I, on the other hand, had been attempting to read the latest medical review, though my thoughts strayed continually to the curious hum that seemed to emanate from Holmes's experiment. "It is remarkable, Watson," said he suddenly, without looking up. "The human ear cannot hear the faintest vibrations of electricity, yet they are as real as the heartbeat of a sleeping city." "You refer to that infernal buzzing sound, I suppose," I replied. "I've heard it for hours, and have wondered whether you were setting out to electrify the entire street." Holmes allowed himself the faintest smile. "Merely an experiment, my dear fellow. I am exploring the possibility that an electric spark can synchronize multiple clocks at once. A trifling curiosity, but one that may, in time, prove of considerable forensic use." I laughed. "You surprise me. You, a man of deduction, stooping to tinker with timepieces." "Time, Watson," said he gravely, "is the one element no murderer can completely conceal. If ever we could fix the moment of a crime with absolute precision, half the mysteries of this world would solve themselves." Before I could respond, there came a sharp rap at the door, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps upon the stairs. "Mrs." Hudson's voice announced, "Inspector Lestrade, sir." Lestrade entered, hat in hand, his expression a mixture of irritation and uncertainty. "Evening, Mr. Holmes. Dr. Watson." Holmes motioned to a chair. "Take a seat, Lestrade. I see from your face that Scotland Yard is once again in need of a consulting brain." Lestrade snorted good-naturedly. "You might say that. There's a queer business down on Bond Street. Hargreaves and Sons, the jewelers. Mr. Percival Hargreaves was found dead in his office this afternoon. Locked door, no sign of struggle, no marks of violence. The coroner's man is calling it heart failure." Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Then you would hardly trouble me with a natural death." "That's just it," said Lestrade, leaning forward. "The odd thing is, every clock and watch in the place, and there must be hundreds, stopped at precisely the same moment, 3:17 p.m. I could not help but exclaim, "Extraordinary! Some electrical failure, perhaps?" Lestrade shook his head. "That's what we thought, but the mains were working fine, and the lamps were burning when they found him. It's a tidy mystery, Mr. Holmes, and though the doctor says heart trouble, I can't get past that business with the clocks." Holmes rose, his keen eyes alight with sudden animation. "My dear Lestrade, you bring me an irresistible problem. Watson, your hat and coat, if you please. It appears time itself has paused to invite us to Bond Street." Within 20 minutes, we were rattling through the mist-shrouded streets in a hansom cab. London at that hour seemed curiously muffled. The usual cries of vendors and rumble of carriages were subdued by the thick fog that rolled in from the river. The yellow halos of gas lamps floated like will-o'-the-wisps through the gloom, and the horses' hooves struck dull echoes on the cobbles. As we neared Bond Street, Lestrade leaned from the window. "That's the place. Hargreaves and Sons, one of the finest jewellers in London, and a respectable man by all accounts. Been there 30 years. Holmes stepped out first, his long coat swirling about him like a shadow. The shop stood dark, save for the faint glow of a single lamp within. A constable stood guard at the door, and the gleam of his buttons caught the light as he saluted. Inside, the air smelled faintly of oil and metal polish. Rows upon rows of watches and clocks filled the shelves. An ocean of silent faces, each frozen in the act of marking a moment now past. The hush was uncanny. Even Lestrade, who was not a man easily unnerved, glanced about as though in a church. The body of Mr. Hargreaves lay upon the carpet behind his desk, his head resting upon his arm as though he had fallen asleep in the midst of writing. A pen had rolled from his hand, leaving a black streak upon the blotter. The expression upon his face was peaceful, almost contented. Holmes knelt beside the body, his gaze sweeping across the scene with the precision of a surveyor. "No sign of struggle," he murmured. "No displacement of the furniture. The man's watch stopped also at 3:17. He examined the windows, the door, the hinges of the lock. Locked from within. Yet, Lestrade, did you notice the faint scorch mark upon the desk?" Lestrade bent down. "Good Lord, so there is. A little black ring, as if from a match." "Not a match," said Holmes. "An electrical discharge. See how the wood is singed evenly? The same faint scent lingers in the air. Ozone. Watson, you smell it?" Indeed, I did. A dry metallic tang that made the nostrils twitch. Holmes straightened, eyes narrowing. "An electric current strong enough to stop every mechanism in the room. That, my dear Lestrade, is no accident. It was engineered." Lestrade frowned. "Engineered? But what for?" Holmes smiled thinly. "That, Inspector, is what we shall presently discover. For the moment, let us treat this not as a death by natural causes, but as a message from the city itself. The clocks have spoken, and we must learn to hear their silence." At that, he turned toward the still ranks of timepieces, their glass faces glimmering faintly in the lamplight, and for a long moment none of us spoke. The quiet was so deep, so absolute, that it seemed the whole of London held its breath in expectation of what Holmes would uncover next. Holmes spent several minutes pacing slowly around the dimly lit office of the late Mr. Hargreaves, his gaze roving over every object with a scrutiny that seemed to take in not merely their form, but their history. He paused before a display cabinet containing an assortment of watches, each halted at the same uncanny instant, 3:17. With a gloved finger, he traced a faint line of soot upon the brass frame, then examined the floor beneath the desk with his magnifying lens. "Observe, Watson," said he at last. "Here, beneath the left leg of the desk, do you perceive this fragment of blackened wire? It has been neatly cut. Now, what might a jeweller require of such wiring?" I stooped beside him. "Possibly a connection for an electric lamp, though I see no fixture nearby." "Precisely. Yet the scorch upon the wood and the pervasive scent of ozone suggest that an electrical current has very recently passed through this space. The phenomenon is localized. Note that only this chamber's clocks are affected. The shop floor outside remains untouched. Our culprit, therefore, was either an electrician of some skill or possessed of knowledge uncommon among tradesmen. Lestrade scratched his chin. Then you're saying this fellow was murdered? With electricity? Holmes gave a slight nod. The possibility cannot be dismissed. A carefully directed discharge, sufficient to arrest the heart, would leave no visible wound. And it would explain why every delicate mechanism in proximity ceased its motion. The shock must have leapt through the desk, travelled by that wire, and radiated outward. A fatal precision. The inspector's brow furrowed. But why the devil would anyone go to such trouble? Why not a knife or poison, if murder was the aim? That, my dear Lestrade, is the very essence of our puzzle, Holmes replied. A man who kills by manipulating time and current seeks not a simple death, but a statement. We must discover what he intended to silence. He turned his attention to the papers strewn upon Hargreaves's desk. The jeweller had been writing in his ledger. The pen had slipped from his hand at the moment of death, leaving a half-finished entry. Holmes examined the page, then frowned. The final line reads, "Shipment received from Antwerp. See page 214 for valuation. Yet page 214 has been torn out." Lestrade bent closer. Could have been an accident. "Hardly," said Holmes. "Hargreaves was a meticulous man. His books are models of order. To remove a page is to erase a transaction. What article, I wonder, arrived from Antwerp that was worth concealing?" He rose and crossed to a tall cabinet of locked drawers. With the constable's permission, he examined each in turn until one yielded a faint rattle. Producing a delicate pick from his pocket, Holmes made quick work of the lock. Inside lay velvet-lined trays of rings and brooches, but in one corner a shallow indentation caught his eye. "An empty case," he murmured. "The dust pattern shows that something narrow and rectangular rested here until recently. Perhaps a watch case, perhaps a small casket. Whatever it was, it has been removed." Lestrade looked uneasy. "Then you think there's been theft?" "I think," said Holmes, "that theft is the motive, but not the whole of it. There is something ceremonial about this arrangement. The halted clocks, the chosen time, the deliberate staging. The killer wished to commemorate the act." He turned toward the doorway leading to the workshop beyond. "Come, Watson, let us see the remainder of the premises." The back room of Hargreaves and Sons was a place of industry. Benches cluttered with magnifiers, gears, and jewelers' tools, the smell of oil and metal strong in the air. Yet even here there was a stillness unnatural to such a place. On one wall hung a large, elaborate clock, whose pendulum had also stopped. Holmes examined its mechanism, then whistled softly. The mainspring is intact, but the escapement wheel is fused. That confirms it, Watson. An electrical overload. "Then it must have been done deliberately," I exclaimed. "Beyond question. A man does not accidentally introduce such a current into a jeweler's apparatus. Moreover, see here." He pointed to a narrow recess in the floorboards where a faint trail of dust had been disturbed. Someone dragged a cable or wire through this gap. The direction leads toward the alley at the rear. We followed it outside. The night air was chill, and the fog pressed close against the narrow lane behind the shop. Holmes knelt once more, inspecting the ground by the lamplight. There were impressions in the damp earth, footprints, several of them, overlapping. 2 men, he muttered. One heavy-set, the other lighter and wearing rubber-soled shoes. A workman, perhaps. The lighter prints overlay the heavier ones, suggesting that the heavier man departed first. That would correspond to Hargreaves, who came here daily to lock the back door after closing. The second man followed him in. Lestrade frowned. But the door was locked from the inside. Holmes tapped the latch thoughtfully. A spring lock. It could easily have been set to close after the intruder's exit. He planned his escape well. As we re-entered the shop, Holmes paused before the silent rows of watches once more. "Lestrade," he said, "what of Hargreaves's assistant?" "Apprentice, you mean?" "Name of Arthur Pennington. Clever lad by all accounts. Been with the firm 5 years. He's the one who found the body. Poor devil was near out of his wits when we arrived." "Indeed. Has he been questioned?" "Only briefly. Said he left at 1 o'clock to deliver a necklace to a client in Kensington and didn't return until after 4. His story checks out. The client confirmed." Holmes gave no reply, but his eyes had taken on that distant, calculating expression I knew so well. "Watson, note this. The crime occurred at 3:17, half an hour before the assistant's return by his account. Curious timing, is it not?" "Do you suspect him?" I asked. "I suspect everyone," said Holmes calmly, "until time itself proves their innocence." He turned back to Lestrade. "Send word to the Yard that I require full particulars of Mr. Hargreaves's recent business dealings, especially any correspondence with Antwerp. Also, have the assistant remain available for further questioning. I will visit him tomorrow morning." We took our leave soon after. As our cab carried us back through the thickening fog, Holmes sat in silence, his long fingers drumming lightly on his knee. "Watson," he said at last, "does it not strike you as odd that every clock should stop at precisely the same instant, yet none bear signs of tampering save the electrical trace?" "Indeed it does." "Then consider what must follow. The mechanism that halted them acted simultaneously. An electrical impulse, yes, but carefully timed. And why 3:17? Why not 3:15 or 3:20? The precision speaks of calculation." "You mean to say," I ventured, "that the hour itself may hold significance?" "Precisely. Time, my dear fellow, is the true witness in this affair. The city may sleep, its people may forget, but the hands of these clocks mark the moment truth ceased to move. We must learn what that moment signifies." The cab rattled on through the gaslit streets, and I could see by the glimmer in Holmes's eyes that his mind was already far ahead of the rest of us, tracing invisible wires through the darkness towards some revelation yet unseen. The following morning dawned grey and oppressive, the sort of London day when the fog seems not merely to descend from the heavens, but to rise from the very stones of the street. When I entered the sitting room, I found Holmes already at the breakfast table, a sheaf of telegrams and documents spread before him, his coffee quite forgotten at his elbow. "Ah, Watson," said he briskly as I took my seat. "I have before me the beginnings of a most curious mosaic. Lestrade has sent the preliminary reports concerning our late jeweller's affairs. Observe these notes from Antwerp." He handed me a crumpled telegram which read, "Shipment confirmed. Special pieces received. Payment due upon delivery. Van der Linde and Co." Antwerp, Holmes continued, is no stranger to illicit trade in precious stones. Van der Linde & Co. is a reputable firm in name only. They have been under suspicion for years. Yet Hargreaves was known for scrupulous honesty. Why, then, should he deal with such a concern? Perhaps he was deceived, I suggested. Possible, but not probable. A man of his experience would not mistake a smuggler for a merchant. No, Watson, this alliance was deliberate, though the purpose remains veiled. He rose abruptly. Finish your coffee. We are bound for Soho. Young Arthur Pennington lodges there, and I mean to take his measure. Within the hour, we were threading our way through the narrow lanes of that bustling quarter where jewelers, clockmakers, and pawnbrokers plied their trades side by side. At last, we arrived at a modest brick building above a watch repair shop. Holmes mounted the stairs and knocked smartly. The door was opened by a pale, anxious-looking young man whose hands trembled visibly as he recognized us. "Mr. Holmes, sir. I didn't expect... Please, come in." His lodgings were tidy to the point of austerity. A single desk, a lamp, a few mechanical drawings pinned to the wall, and the faint ticking of a solitary clock filled the silence. Holmes's eyes swept the room in one long, measuring glance. "You were much attached to your employer, I believe," he said at length. "Yes, sir. Mr. Hargreaves was a fine man, fair but exacting. He taught me everything I know about watchmaking." Holmes nodded slowly. A rare education, yet his end was as mysterious as his art. "You left him alive at 1 o'clock, did you not?" "Yes, sir. I had a delivery to make in Kensington. Mrs. Willoughby, 12 Marlborough Terrace. She can confirm it." "She has," Holmes replied evenly. "And you returned at what hour?" "Just after 4. I found the door to the office locked and the lights dim. When I looked through the glass, he was... The young man's voice broke. "He never had an enemy in the world, sir." Holmes regarded him keenly. "And yet he had business with Van der Linde & Co." Pennington's eyes flickered in surprise. "You know of that?" "Yes. He mentioned them once. Some special order of chronometers for a foreign client. I never saw the pieces myself. He handled that work privately." "Did he speak of any meetings scheduled for yesterday?" The young man hesitated. "Not exactly a meeting, sir, but he did say he was expecting a gentleman around 3. I was told to make myself scarce. I assumed it was a buyer of some importance." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "A visitor at 3. The clocks stop at 3:17. Remarkable symmetry, is it not?" He stood and moved to the desk, examining the sketches pinned upon the wall. "These are your own designs, I take it?" "Yes, sir. I've been working on a method of synchronizing multiple watches by electrical pulse. It's only an experiment, hardly worth mentioning." Holmes turned sharply, his expression unreadable. "Indeed? You and Mr. Hargreaves, it seems, shared similar interests. Did you ever test this invention in the shop?" "Once or twice, sir, under Mr. Hargreaves's supervision. But it was harmless, just a small spark to trigger the movements together. We abandoned it months ago." Holmes's gaze softened, though the keenness in his eyes did not diminish. "I see. You have been most helpful, Mr. Pennington. I may call upon you again shortly." When we had descended the stairs, I could not restrain my curiosity. "Holmes, do you suspect the young man?" "Suspect? My dear Watson, I suspect everyone who is intelligent enough to devise a mechanism of synchronized motion and nervous enough to conceal the depth of his knowledge." Whether his guilt extends beyond invention remains to be seen. He hailed a cab and directed the driver toward Bond Street once more. Our next step lies with Van der Linde & Co. Their London agent resides in an office on Fenchurch Street. Let us see whether the tentacles of this Antwerp concern reach farther than commerce. The firm's office proved to be a narrow suite above a shipping warehouse. A clerk received us, his accent thick with the guttural tones of the Low Countries. Holmes introduced himself under the pretext of acquiring rare watch parts and inquired casually after recent shipments. The clerk, none too cautious, produced a ledger. While pretending to peruse it idly, Holmes's eyes darted swiftly down the columns. "Ah, I see you received consignments to Hargreaves & Sons within the past month," he remarked. "Remarkably frequent for a jeweller of modest scale." "Yes, monsieur," said the clerk, smiling uneasily. "Special orders, fine work for special clients." Holmes returned the ledger and thanked him, but as we turned to go, he paused, feigning a moment's forgetfulness. "Tell me, my good fellow, this city of silent witnesses. I see the name here in the margin beside the Hargreaves entry. What is that? A company?" The clerk's composure faltered. "Ah, that. Just a private society, monsieur. Nothing of concern." Holmes's tone turned almost jovial. "On the contrary, I find private societies invariably fascinating. Do they perhaps appreciate fine timepieces?" The clerk stammered something inaudible. Holmes smiled thinly and took his leave. Once outside, his expression hardened. "There we have it, Watson. The first whisper of conspiracy. The city of silent witnesses. A name both poetic and ominous. I dare say it is no coincidence that it surfaces beside the last business dealings of our deceased jeweller." We walked in silence for some time, our footsteps echoing on the wet pavement. Finally, Holmes stopped before a cab stand. "Watson, we must learn the purpose of that society. Make a note of the name. It shall be the key to all that follows." That evening, as the fog closed once more about Baker Street, Holmes sat with his violin across his knees, the firelight glinting upon the polished wood. "Watson," he said quietly, "the city has grown noisier of late, yet in its noise there is a silence where truth hides. These men, whoever they are, cloak themselves behind timepieces and charity, but time, as ever, will betray them." He drew the bow across the strings, and the low, haunting note filled the room like a voice calling from some unseen depth. The melody rose and fell, echoing faintly against the window panes, as if every silent clock in London had paused to listen. I said nothing, for I knew that when Holmes turned to his violin, the storm of his mind was at its height, and that before long his music would find its answer in reason. 2 days later, I found Holmes once again immersed in his peculiar occupation of deciphering silence. The morning newspapers, with their usual zeal for sensation, had seized upon the Hargreaves affair and christened it the case of the stopped clocks. They speculated freely upon supernatural causes, some claiming that a curse lay upon the jeweller's house, others hinting at secret experiments gone awry. Holmes regarded these theories with amused disdain. "It is the inevitable fate of mystery, my dear Watson," said he, tossing aside the Standard. "When men lack facts, they substitute fancies. But we, fortunately, are not dependent upon the imagination of Fleet Street." He rose and crossed to the mantel, where the remnants of his morning correspondence lay. Lestrade has sent me an address connected with our enigmatic society, the City of Silent Witnesses. It appears they lease a hall on Bishopsgate under the pretext of holding exhibitions of horology, antique clocks and such. Tonight, they host a private gathering. Attendance is by invitation only. I looked up from my chair. And I presume you have secured us invitations? Holmes smiled faintly. Not precisely, but I have seldom found a locked door proof against a plausible story and a confident manner. You shall accompany me, Watson, as my partner, Professor of Mechanical Chronometry at the University of Edinburgh, now residing in London. I am honoured, I said dryly, though I doubt I shall play the part with your fluency. You need only nod wisely and stroke your moustache at intervals, said Holmes, with a rare twinkle in his eye. Leave the talk to me. The evening came on damp and windy, the streets glistening under the gas lamps as our cab rattled eastward. The hall we sought was an imposing structure wedged between warehouses, its windows curtained, a brass plaque by the door bearing only the discreet initials CSW. Inside, a liveried attendant accepted our cards without question, and we found ourselves ushered into a lofty chamber whose walls were lined with clocks of every imaginable design. There were perhaps 30 gentlemen present, all soberly dressed and speaking in subdued tones. At the far end of the room stood a dais, upon which rested a magnificent clock encased in crystal, its pendulum gleaming like a blade. The air was thick with the faint, oily scent of machinery. Holmes leaned close. Observe the composition of the company, Watson. Tradesmen, collectors, one or two foreign dealers. But note also that every man here wears the same small pin upon his lapel, a design of a clock face with no hands, a symbol of silence. Before I could reply, a bell rang and the murmurs subsided. A tall, narrow-faced man in evening dress mounted the dais. His features were sharp, his eyes coldly intelligent. Gentlemen, he began, I welcome you once more to our assembly of the City of Silent Witnesses. Time is our master, yet we alone master time. A murmur of approval rippled through the room. The speaker continued. Our late associate, Mr. Hargreaves, has, unfortunately, departed from our midst. His loss is regrettable, though his work will endure. Tonight, we continue his vision. At the mention of Hargreaves's name, Holmes's eyes flashed. He whispered, Listen well, Watson. The tone of mourning conceals something deeper, perhaps guilt. The man upon the dais gestured to two assistants, who unveiled a complex apparatus connected by wires to several clocks placed about the room. Behold, he said proudly, the synchronizer. With this device, we may command every instrument of time within our reach to halt or advance at our signal. Think of it. Commerce, communication, even law, all subject to our silent authority. There was polite applause. Holmes's fingers tightened upon his cane. Good heavens, Watson, he muttered under his breath. They are no mere enthusiasts. They are conspirators. A society that can stop time in the city could control the evidence of crime itself. The demonstration began. The assistant threw a switch, and instantly every clock in the hall stopped dead. A chill went through me. The silence that followed was uncanny. Then, with another movement, the clocks resumed their ticking in perfect harmony. When the applause had died, Holmes moved among the crowd, engaging several members in conversation. He introduced himself as a fellow inventor and and asked artless questions about the society's purpose. I soon lost sight of him in the throng, and for several minutes wandered uneasily among the exhibits, conscious of curious glances directed toward me. Presently, Holmes returned, his expression grave. "We must leave at once," he whispered. "I have seen enough." We made our exit without incident, but once in the cab, I turned to him in astonishment. "What on earth have you discovered?" "Confirmation, Watson, of my growing suspicion. This society is a front, a fraternity for those engaged in the illicit transfer of jewels and precious metals. The synchronizer is no innocent toy. It provides a pretext for the transport of goods whose value is measured by weight, not by craftsmanship. Their clocks serve as vessels, hollowed, disguised, filled with smuggled stones. Then Hargreaves was their craftsman," said Holmes grimly, "the man who built their ingenious devices. But at some point, conscience or fear overtook him. He sought to withdraw or to expose them. They silenced him accordingly, using his own invention to do the deed." A heavy rain had begun to fall, the sound mingling with the rattle of the cab as we approached Baker Street. Holmes sat deep in thought. "The question remains, who struck the fatal blow? The tall man upon the dais, the one who spoke of mastery over time. He is their leader, no doubt. But he would not sully his hands. No, the act required someone closer, someone trusted, someone who could gain access to the workshop without alarm. Arthur Pennington, I breathed. Holmes nodded slowly. So it would appear. Yet appearances deceive. Pennington is intelligent, yes, but inexperienced. He may have been manipulated by subtler minds. Still, he holds the key, literally. We shall visit him again tomorrow. That night, Holmes scarcely slept. Long after I had retired, I heard him pacing the floor, his violin murmuring low phrases that came and went like whispers through the fog. Once, I heard him mutter, "The clocks, the wire, the missing page. What binds them? What binds them?" By morning, his face was drawn, but his eyes burned with purpose. "Watson," said he, "fetch your coat. I have sent Lestrade to bring Pennington to Baker Street. We shall learn today whether he is pawn or player." When the young man arrived, pale and trembling, Holmes motioned him to a chair. "Mr. Pennington," he said quietly, "I have reason to believe that your late employer was engaged in a dangerous enterprise. You were aware, perhaps, of a society calling itself the City of Silent Witnesses." The youth's lips parted, and for a moment he seemed about to deny it. Then he buried his face in his hands. "I didn't want any part of it, sir. I swear it. They promised riches, said it was only mechanical work, nothing illegal. Mr. Hargreaves found out too late. He meant to go to the police. They made me help install the synchronizer in the shop." Holmes leaned forward. "And on the day of his death?" "He said he was going to cut them off. He had proof, records, sketches. He kept them in his ledger. That's why they killed him. I was ordered to fetch a component from the warehouse to get me out of the way. When I came back, he was gone." Holmes rose slowly, his voice low but firm. "You have done wrong, Mr. Pennington, but not beyond redemption. You shall assist me in bringing these men to justice. You will return to their hall tonight as though nothing has occurred. Tell them the police are satisfied with the verdict of natural death. And then, when the leader shows himself, you will signal me." Pennington looked terrified. "They'll kill me, sir." "Not while I keep watch," said Holmes. His eyes gleamed with that steely light I had come to know well. The city of silent witnesses has stopped many clocks, Watson. Let us see if we cannot set them moving once more. Outside, the rain fell harder, drumming upon the windows. It seemed to me that even the city itself, vast and grey and ancient, was holding its breath, waiting for the hour when Holmes would strike back against those who thought they could command time itself. It was late afternoon when Holmes and I left Baker Street once more, bound upon that most perilous errand, to lay a trap for the masters of the city of silent witnesses. The fog, as though aware of our purpose, hung low and dense, muffling the sound of our footsteps and turning the gas lamps to blurred yellow smears. Pennington had gone ahead, carrying with him Holmes's precise instructions, his face white as parchment, but his resolve firm. Holmes spoke little as we rode eastward. His eyes were half closed, his hands clasped before him, yet I knew that every faculty of that extraordinary brain was concentrated upon the coming encounter. At last, as the cab rattled over the wet cobbles of Bishopsgate, he opened his eyes and said quietly, "Watson, tonight we must move as one mind. There can be no hesitation. The faintest error will cost lives, perhaps ours among them." "You may rely upon me," I answered, though I confess my heart was beating uncomfortably fast. Our plan was simple, but perilous in execution. Pennington was to attend the evening's meeting of the Society and repeat to its leaders the story that Lestrade had accepted the theory of heart failure. He would express relief that suspicion had passed and hint that he had destroyed any incriminating papers. Meanwhile, Holmes and I, accompanied by Lestrade and two plainclothes officers, would conceal ourselves in the gallery overlooking the hall. When Holmes gave the prearranged signal, a flick of his lantern glass, the police would descend. We reached the building shortly before 8 o'clock. The door at the rear by which we were to enter stood ajar as arranged. Within, the air was heavy with the scent of oil and brass polish. We ascended a narrow stair to a balcony that ran along the upper wall of the great chamber. Through the railing, we could see the floor below, where the gathering was assembling much as before. The same tall, ascetic man whom we had seen presiding earlier stood by the dais, speaking in low tones with a short, broad-shouldered fellow whose face was partly hidden by the brim of his hat. Holmes touched my arm and whispered, "The leader and his enforcer, Bartholdi and Krantz, both known to the Antwerp police. Mark them well." The meeting began precisely at 8. A murmur of clocks filled the hall, every pendulum moving in solemn unison. It was a sound curiously oppressive, as if the very air pulsed with mechanical life. Bartholdi raised his hand, and the ticking ceased abruptly. "Brothers," he said, his voice carrying through the silence, "our work continues. The authorities remain ignorant. The last of Hargreaves's notes has been retrieved and destroyed. We owe our gratitude to Mr. Pennington, whose loyalty has proven beyond question." A faint stir ran through the audience as Pennington stepped forward. His pallor was ghastly, but he managed a stiff bow. I could see his hands trembling at his sides. Holmes's gaze never left him. Bartholdi continued, "We are on the verge of a new commission, one that will enrich us beyond measure. The synchronizer will soon serve not merely our city, but all Europe. And now, gentlemen, before we proceed, a demonstration. Mr. Krantz, the apparatus." At the signal, Krantz wheeled forward the infernal device, a tangle of copper coils and batteries mounted upon a polished oak base. Wires ran from it to several of the surrounding clocks. Bartholdi smiled thinly. "Observe," he said, "the obedience of time." He pressed a lever, and instantly every clock halted. A faint blue spark flashed along the wires. "A single pulse," he said softly, "and the city sleeps." Holmes's whisper reached my ear. "The same method, Watson, used to end Hargreaves's life. Note the power source, insulated but sufficient for a fatal charge." Below, Pennington swayed slightly, his face glistening with sweat. Bartholdi turned to him. "You, my young friend, will assist us in calibrating the new circuit. Stand there, beside the coil." Holmes's hand tightened on my shoulder. "If they mean to test it through him, good God, we must act now." He reached for the lantern, but at that instant, Pennington made a sudden movement. His voice rang through the hall, hoarse but clear. "No, no more lies. You murdered him, murdered Mr. Hargreaves. I'll not be your servant another hour." A cry of rage broke from Krantz, who sprang forward. The room erupted in confusion. Bartholdi shouted for silence, but the officers, following Holmes's signal, were already descending the stairs. I snatched my revolver from my pocket and followed close behind. Holmes vaulted the railing with the agility of a cat. "Stop, Krantz," he commanded. "The game is finished." The heavy-set man swung toward him, a revolver gleaming in his hand. There was a flash, a deafening report, and the bullet buried itself in the wall behind Holmes. In the same instant, Lestrade and his men burst in from the lower door, shouting, "In the name of the law!" Pandemonium ensued. Some of the members tried to flee, others froze in terror. Holmes sprang upon Krantz, striking the weapon from his grasp, while Bartholdi made for the dais. I fired a warning shot above his head. He halted, his face livid. "It is useless," said Holmes coldly, straightening his coat. "The police have your building surrounded. Every piece of evidence you so carefully hoarded will serve to hang you." Bartholdi sneered. "You think you've triumphed, Mr. Holmes, but you do not yet understand. Our work will continue. Elsewhere, with others. You cannot stop time." Holmes's reply was as swift as it was cutting. "On the contrary, I can set it moving again." He crossed to the device and examined it with rapid precision. A crude but deadly instrument. "See, Watson, this lever here controls the discharge. One adjustment, and the circuit is rendered harmless." With a deft twist, he disconnected the main coil. The low hum ceased, and the room grew still. Bartholdi made a desperate attempt to break free, but Lestrade's men closed in. He was handcuffed and led away, his face a mask of hatred. Krantz, bleeding from a gash on his temple, was dragged beside him. When the last of the conspirators had been secured, Pennington sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. "It's over," he murmured. "Thank God, it's over." Holmes laid a hand upon his shoulder. "Courage, my boy. You have helped to expose one of the most insidious organizations this city has ever harbored. Your repentance may yet weigh in your favor." Lestrade approached, wiping his brow. "Well, Mr. Holmes, that's a night's work if ever there was one. I'll not soon forget the sight of you flying over that railing like a blasted acrobat." Holmes allowed himself a brief smile. "Necessity, Inspector. The criminal mind rarely affords the luxury of a staircase." Within the hour, the hall was cleared. The police carried away the synchronizer and boxes of clocks, whose innocent faces concealed secret compartments of smuggled jewels. Holmes, I and Lestrade lingered a moment longer amid the wreckage. The city of silent witnesses, Holmes said thoughtfully, is silent indeed. But it will speak volumes in the assize court. Outside, the rain had ceased and the fog was lifting. As we stepped into the night, the distant bells of St. Paul's struck 11. Their measured tones echoed down the empty street, solemn and reassuring, as though the great city itself were marking the restoration of order. Holmes paused, listening. You hear, Watson? Time moves once more. The city breathes again. He turned his face toward the faint glimmer of dawn beginning in the east. There will always be those who seek to command time, to silence its witness. But so long as we listen, truly listen, the truth will never be mute. And with that, he strode into the thinning mist, his tall figure framed against the awakening light, leaving behind another of those strange, perilous nights that only Sherlock Holmes could turn from mortal danger into triumph of reason. The events of that dreadful night were still vivid in my mind the next morning as I sat opposite Holmes at our breakfast table. The newspapers had not yet grasped the full import of the arrest, but their headlines blazed with half-truths and conjecture. Sensational capture of a foreign gang. Mastermind exposed by Mr. Sherlock Holmes. I read the reports aloud, and Holmes smiled faintly over his coffee. Public admiration, Watson, said he, is a capricious mistress. She applauds loudly what she only half understands. Still, I confess, I take some satisfaction in seeing those scoundrels removed from the city's bloodstream. London breathes a little freer today. Then the affair is at an end? I asked. He shook his head. Not quite. The body of the serpent is slain, but its head remains to be identified. Bartholdi was but an instrument, a brilliant one perhaps, but still a tool. Someone higher directed his actions. The Society's funds, its elaborate apparatus, its international contacts. These require a guiding intelligence beyond his means. Until we trace that intelligence, I shall not consider the case closed. Lestrade arrived later that morning, his habitual briskness tempered by genuine respect. I've never seen a gang brought down so neatly, Mr. Holmes. Scotland Yard owes you a debt. The papers call it the City of Silent Witnesses case. We're already finding connections between their books and several jewel thefts across the continent. Holmes inclined his head. You are kind, Inspector. Yet we must beware of mistaking a shadow for substance. Tell me, have you examined the recovered ledgers? They're in the Yard's evidence room now, said Lestrade. Mostly lists of shipments, coded entries, foreign names. We'll have them deciphered in time. Permit me a look before your experts spoil them with overzealous theorizing, Holmes said dryly. I suspect the key to the cipher is not linguistic, but mechanical. That afternoon, we accompanied Lestrade to Scotland Yard. In a small, lamplit chamber, Holmes spread the ledgers before him and began turning the pages with care. Each line consisted of curious symbols, half circles, vertical bars, and small dots placed at irregular intervals. To the untrained eye they appeared meaningless, but Holmes's expression sharpened at once. Remarkable, he murmured. Watson, do these not remind you of anything? I examined the page. It has the appearance of clock markings. Minutes, perhaps? Exactly. Each symbol corresponds to a position upon the dial. These are not letters, but hours and minutes. A record of time, not of language. Lestrade stared in bewilderment. Then what does it signify? Transactions disguised as times of day, said Holmes. For instance, an entry marked 2:45, followed by 7:20, could denote the transfer of goods between 2 points, the first representing the sender, the second the receiver. The genius of the code lies in its plausibility. To anyone ignorant of the scheme, it appears a mere record of experiments in synchronization. The author of this system must have possessed both mathematical precision and criminal audacity. He turned several more pages, then stopped abruptly. Here, note this recurring symbol, 3 dots arranged triangularly beside the hour 3:17, the very time of Hargreaves's death. It appears again and again. Lestrade whistled. Then they used that as a signal? A signature, Holmes corrected. The mark of their unseen master. Whoever he is, he orchestrated the murder with exactitude. We must find the man who signs his work with triangles of time. We left the yard with more questions than answers. For several days, Holmes remained in seclusion, emerging only to fetch reference books or pace the sitting room in deep thought. He spoke little, but I noticed that he often consulted the clock upon the mantel, adjusting its hands minutely, as though searching for some hidden alignment. At last, on the 4th evening, he broke his silence. "Watson," said he, "have you ever considered the peculiar power of repetition? In music, it creates harmony. In crime, it betrays obsession. Our unknown mastermind, let us call him the horologist, repeats his motif endlessly. The hour of 3:17 dominates every record. Why? Because it was the hour of a triumph or of a loss. I have traced several thefts abroad that occurred at that same time precisely. Antwerp, Amsterdam, Vienna, each incident bears his invisible signature. Then he must still be at large." Holmes nodded grimly. "And not far. The pattern narrows to London. Indeed, I believe he has already sent a message to me." He handed me an envelope of heavy cream paper. Upon it was printed in fine copperplate, "To Mr. Sherlock Holmes, 221B Baker Street." The postmark bore that very day's date. Inside lay a single watch face. No hands, no mechanism, only a blank dial engraved with 3-minute dots forming a triangle at the center. Beneath it, a note in the same elegant script. "Time waits for no man, Mr. Holmes. Meet me where silence is measured. Midnight tomorrow." "Good heavens," I exclaimed. "It is a trap." "Undoubtedly," said Holmes calmly, slipping the dial into his pocketbook. "But one that we must accept. The phrase, 'where silence is measured.' What does that suggest to you?" "A clock tower, perhaps, or a bell foundry." Holmes's eyes brightened. "Precisely. There are but few such places in London where silence and time coexist. The largest and most secluded is the disused bell foundry at Clerkenwell, the same that once cast the bells of St. Paul's. It has been deserted these 10 years. That is our destination." He leaned back, lighting his pipe. The blue smoke curled lazily toward the ceiling. "Our adversary is confident, Watson. He wishes to confront me personally. Such vanity is always the downfall of intellect. But we must tread carefully. Bring your revolver. I fancy we may need it." The following night was cold and still. A thin crescent moon hung over the rooftops as we made our way through the narrow lanes of Clerkenwell. The foundry loomed ahead, its tall chimney black against the sky. No light shone within. Lestrade, who had insisted on accompanying us despite Holmes's objections, posted 2 constables at the gate and followed us inside. The interior was vast and echoing, filled with the ghostly shapes of furnaces and casting pits. Our footsteps rang hollow on the stone floor. At the far end stood a gigantic bell, its surface tarnished with age. Holmes approached it slowly. "Here," he said softly. "Do you hear that, Watson? The faint ticking within?" I listened. Somewhere, deep inside the bell, there was indeed a rhythmic sound, too regular to be mere echo. Holmes crouched and produced a small lantern. Its beam revealed a wire trailing from beneath the bell's rim, disappearing into the shadows. He followed it cautiously, and we came upon a small metal box affixed to the wall, a clockwork mechanism of intricate design. Holmes examined it with growing intensity. "A synchronizer, modified for detonation," he whispered. "This entire chamber is wired. The device is set to discharge at midnight precisely." Lestrade swore under his breath. "Then the note. He means to kill us." Holmes's eyes were like steel. "Not if I can prevent it. Watson, hand me the screwdriver from my coat pocket. Steady. Every second counts." The ticking quickened ominously as Holmes worked, his long fingers deft but tense. Sweat stood upon his brow. "The current is stored in a condenser. If I sever the wrong wire, the circuit will complete. Ah, there." With a sharp twist, he disconnected the final lead. The ticking ceased. A sigh escaped all three of us. At that instant, a voice echoed through the foundry. "Ingenious as ever, Mr. Holmes. I half expected you to prevail." We spun around. A figure stood upon the gallery above, cloaked in shadow. Holmes's lantern beam caught the gleam of spectacles and a pale, angular face. "The horologist," murmured Holmes. "So the master reveals himself at last." The man inclined his head. "You meddle beautifully, sir, but even you cannot halt what has already begun. Time, once broken, cannot be mended." He raised his hand. In it glinted a small remote device. Holmes leapt forward, shouting, "Down, Watson!" But before he could reach the gallery, the man pressed the button. A flash seared the air, followed by a deafening crash. Smoke filled the hall, and when it cleared, the gallery was empty. The horologist had vanished. Holmes stood motionless amid the settling dust, his face pale but composed. "He lives," he said quietly, "and he has declared war. The city of silent witnesses may be destroyed, Watson, but its founder walks free." He turned toward the shattered remains of the device, his expression set. "And until I find him, I fear London's clocks will never truly strike in peace again." The explosion at the Clerkenwell foundry had shaken London, though the newspapers, mercifully ignorant of the full truth, reported it merely as a minor accident during the dismantling of old machinery. No mention was made of the mysterious figure Holmes had confronted, the horologist, nor of the device that might have reduced half a city block to ashes. But in the quiet of Baker Street, the affair was far from forgotten. For several days, Holmes remained unusually withdrawn. He spent his hours pacing the length of the sitting room, his pipe clenched between his teeth, surrounded by an ever-growing drift of notes and sketches. At intervals, he would pause before the mantel clock, adjust its hands minutely, then resume his restless stride. It was on the third evening that I ventured to break the silence. "Holmes," said I, "you have neither eaten nor slept since the foundry. Surely the danger is past. The gang has been broken, the apparatus destroyed. What remains?" He stopped abruptly, turning his pale, hawk-like face toward me. "What remains, Watson, is the mind that conceived it all. The horologist is no common criminal. He is an intellect of the first order, a mathematician, a physicist, and a philosopher of crime. His devices were not built for profit alone. No, my friend, he seeks mastery over time itself, not metaphorically, but literally. I could not suppress a smile. My dear Holmes, you surely do not mean— Not in the mystical sense, he interrupted sharply, but in the practical one. Consider it. By controlling the instruments which measure time, he controls perception. A murder at 3:17 may appear to occur at 3:20. An alibi that depends upon a watch or clock can be fabricated at will. The city of silent witnesses was more than a smuggling ring. It was an experiment in manipulation of chronology. And London, with its millions of ticking hearts, was his laboratory. I confess, I shuddered. Then the man is mad. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Mad, perhaps, but brilliant. And now that we have crossed his path, he will not rest until he proves himself my superior. He will strike again. His prophecy proved grimly accurate. 2 nights later, Lestrade burst into our rooms, his face drawn and anxious. "Another death, Mr. Holmes," he announced without preamble. "A Mr. Oliver Radcliffe, banker, found dead at his desk in Lombard Street. The doctors call it apoplexy, but every clock in his office stopped at 3:17. Holmes finished for him. Lestrade's astonishment was almost comical. "By George, how did you—" Holmes was already on his feet, seizing his coat. "Because our adversary has declared his signature. The horologist has struck again." We followed Lestrade through the fog-bound streets to the financial district, where the grand facade of Radcliffe and Co. loomed pale under the gaslights. Inside, the atmosphere was one of hushed alarm. Clerks clustered in corners, whispering nervously, while a constable stood guard at the door of the private office. The scene within bore the unmistakable stamp of the same method. Radcliffe sat slumped over his ledger, his pen fallen from his fingers, the ink dried in mid-stroke. Every clock in the room, 6 of them, from a wall regulator to a tiny carriage watch, had ceased at the fatal minute. Holmes moved among them silently, examining each in turn. "Fused contacts here," he murmured, "and again here. The current must have passed through the brass fittings of the desk, remarkably similar to Hargreaves's case. Our man refines his art." Lestrade pointed to the body. "No signs of struggle. His clerk says he heard a faint crackling noise like static, then silence. When he entered, the old gentleman was dead." Holmes stooped beside the corpse, inspecting the hand that still clutched a half-written note. "Appointment confirmed for Thursday the 17th at 3 o'clock, he read aloud. "Watson, note the date, the 17th once again. The man's obsession deepens." He rose abruptly. "Lestrade, search this office for any recent correspondence with Antwerp or the continent. Our quarry's roots still lie abroad." While the inspector obeyed, Holmes moved to the window. He stood there for several moments, motionless, gazing out into the swirling fog. "Watson," he said at last, "do you recall the triangular mark we found in the ledgers of the City of Silent Witnesses?" "Indeed, I do." "Then observe this." He lifted a sheet of paper from Radcliffe's desk, upon which was stamped a seal, a triangle enclosing a stylized clock face without hands. "Our phantom has signed his work once more, but see the faint impression upon the wax. It is not from Radcliffe's seal, but from one pressed over it. The horologist is taunting us, leaving his emblem as the artist leaves his monogram. Lestrade returned carrying a packet of letters. "Here, Mr. Holmes, found in the drawer, one of them postmarked Antwerp." Holmes tore it open. Inside was a single line in the same elegant script we had seen before. "When the city sleeps, the witness awakes." He read it twice, then folded it carefully. "We are dealing with a man who delights in riddles. But riddles, Watson, are but veils of logic. Let us lift this one." That night, we worked late into the small hours, surrounded by maps, diagrams, and stacks of newspapers. Holmes had every clock in the room set to different times, each ticking in dissonant rhythm. "To study the enemy," he said grimly, "one must think as he thinks. Every mechanism tells a story if one has the patience to listen." Around 2 a.m, he sprang from his chair with sudden animation. "Watson, I have it!" The phrase, "when the city sleeps," it refers not to night, but to stillness, when every clock in London stops. And where might such a silence occur again? At the Central Telegraph Office, where thousands of synchronized clocks depend upon one electric impulse. If that current were interrupted, the entire city's time would halt, I finished. Precisely. And the horologist would prove his supremacy over London itself. He seized his violin and struck a fierce, triumphant chord. "Tomorrow, Watson, we go to the telegraph office. If my reasoning is sound, he will attempt his grand demonstration within the week. The date will be the 17th, the hour 3:17. I could not help but feel a chill, though the fire burned bright. Then the final confrontation approaches. Holmes smiled thinly. "Yes, my dear fellow, the hands of fate are already moving toward that fatal minute, and for once, even I must admit, I would not care to wager which of us shall stop them first." The next morning dawned bleak and colourless. The bells of St. Paul's tolled the hour, echoing through the mist. Each note seemed to linger unnaturally long, as if the city itself were reluctant to move forward. Holmes stood by the window, watching the grey streets below. "Mark my words, Watson," he said softly. "Before another week has passed, London will learn that time can bleed." 3 days later, Holmes's prediction began to take form. The morning papers spoke of strange electrical disturbances across the city, telegraph lines that faltered for a moment and resumed, railway clocks that lost several minutes in unison. Even the Bank of England's great regulator reported a sudden stoppage. The incidents were scattered, trivial perhaps, but to Holmes they were the unmistakable prelude to something far greater. "The horologist is testing his mechanism," said he, his eyes gleaming with that peculiar light which always heralded action. "He is probing the arteries of the city, measuring its pulse. When he strikes again, it will not be a single death, but the paralysis of London itself." We were soon at the Central Telegraph Office, an immense building humming with the ceaseless murmur of Morse code. Banks of instruments lined the walls, and the rhythmic tapping filled the air like rain upon glass. Holmes, having obtained the cooperation of the superintendent, was given access to the main control room, where the electric time signal was distributed throughout the capital. "This, Watson," he said, gesturing to the great switchboard before us, "is the beating heart of modern civilization. From this point, every clock within a radius of 20 miles receives its impulse. If our adversary can interrupt or corrupt that signal, he holds the entire city in his grasp. He moved among the instruments with cat-like precision, his gaze darting from wire to dial. No tampering visible. The system is immaculate. Yet our man does not require entry. A small transmitter placed upon the main line could induce a countercurrent strong enough to halt the mechanism. All he needs is proximity. Lestrade, who had joined us by Holmes's request, looked uneasy. "Then we'll double the guard, Mr. Holmes. No one enters or leaves without my order." Holmes shook his head. "He will not attack under watchful eyes. He is patient, a man who deals in seconds as others do in days. But mark me, he will come." That evening we returned to Baker Street, and for the first time I saw genuine weariness in my friend's face. He sank into his chair and stared long into the fire. "Watson," he said quietly, "I have hunted many minds, clever, ruthless, cold. But this one frightens me, not for myself, but for the city. He thinks as I think, anticipates as I anticipate. We are mirror images, and the reflection is growing darker." I had no answer to that. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the faint ticking of the mantel clock, steady, reassuring, and yet, in that moment, menacing in its constancy. The following morning brought a visitor, Arthur Pennington, pale and haggard, clutching a small parcel. "Mr. Holmes," he said in a trembling voice, "I found this among Mr. Hargreaves's papers. I think it belongs to you." He handed Holmes a curious contrivance, part watch, part compass, the dial bearing once again the triangle of 3 dots. Holmes examined it with intense interest. "Excellent, my boy. You have rendered us a service beyond price. This is no mere ornament. Observe the casing, copper alloy, insulated. Inside, a miniature galvanic coil and a timing lever. The horologist's handiwork without doubt." He placed it upon the table and leaned close, listening. It hums faintly, alive still. "Watson, do you hear?" Indeed, there was a delicate vibration, a barely perceptible rhythm. Holmes's face grew grave. "He has refined the design. This is a receiver, not a transmitter. It responds to an external signal. He means to trigger all such devices at once, perhaps hundreds scattered through the city. Imagine it, Watson. Every clock, every watch, every chronometer seizing in unison at his command." Lestrade, who had just entered, stared in dismay. "You mean the whole city could stop?" "For a moment, yes. But in that moment, chaos would reign. Telegraphs fail, trains halt, banks close, alarms fall silent. It would be the purest demonstration of power since the invention of steam. And mark you, Inspector, the hour chosen will be 3:17. We agreed upon immediate precautions. Lestrade ordered watch kept at the telegraph office and every electrical substation. Holmes, meanwhile, sent urgent telegrams to the Home Office and to the constabulary of every district. Yet he remained restless. "The horologist will not be caught by vigilance alone," he muttered. "He thrives on expectation. To outwit him, we must invite him to act where we choose." "What do you propose?" I asked. "A decoy," said Holmes, rising swiftly. "We shall let it be known that the central time circuit is being transferred tonight to the auxiliary office at Charing Cross. The rumor will reach him. His agents are everywhere. If he strikes, it will be there, and we shall be ready." By midnight, the great hall of the Charing Cross office was empty, save for ourselves, Lestrade's men, and the hum of machinery. Every clock on the walls gleamed in the lamplight, their pendulums swinging with mechanical grace. Holmes stood before the master switch, his eyes fixed upon the dial of his watch. 2 minutes to the hour, he said softly. Watson, note the stillness. Even the air seems to hold its breath. We waited. The seconds crawled. Then, at precisely 3:17, the lights flickered and went out. A faint crackling filled the darkness. Every clock stopped. Holmes's voice cut through the gloom. There, the current, diverted. He is near. A glimmer of movement came from the gallery above, a silhouette against the faint glow of the emergency lamps. Without hesitation, Holmes drew his revolver. "Hold there!" he shouted. "You are surrounded." The figure turned, and for an instant the pale light fell upon his face, a face of almost ethereal calm, framed by silver hair, the eyes gleaming with cold amusement. "Too late, Mr. Holmes," said the horologist. "Time belongs to me now." He pressed something in his hand. Sparks leapt from the nearest machine, and the air filled with the acrid smell of ozone. Lestrade's men fired upward, but the figure had already retreated into shadow. Holmes bounded after him, his cloak streaming, and I followed close behind. We tore through the corridors, the darkness lit by the intermittent flash of broken wires. The sound of footsteps echoed ahead, swift and light. Then came the clang of a door, and when we reached it, we found only emptiness. "He has vanished again," I gasped. Holmes examined the ground with his lantern. "No. Look, the soot on the sill. He escaped through the ventilation shaft. The man knows every hidden artery of this city." He straightened slowly, his expression unreadable. "But he has overreached himself, Watson. In stopping the city's clocks, he has left his own trace, a current strong enough to be traced back to its source. We shall find him yet." At that moment, the lamps flickered back to life, and the clocks resumed their ticking as though nothing had occurred. Outside, through the high windows, dawn was breaking over London, pale and cold. Holmes stood by the switchboard, his shadow long against the wall. "He thinks himself master of time," he murmured. "But every master leaves an echo. We have only to listen." And as the first chime of morning rang from St. Martin's, I saw in his eyes that fierce spark once more, the light of the hunter who has found the scent again. For 2 full days after the incident at Charing Cross, London buzzed with nervous conjecture. The newspapers, eager to attribute the brief failure of the telegraph network to some trifling mechanical error, assured their readers that there was no cause for alarm. But those of us who had witnessed the event knew better. Every clock that night had faltered. Every instrument of precision paused at the same instant, 3:17. The horologist had spoken, and his message had been heard in silence. Holmes, who for 48 hours scarcely touched food or rest, immersed himself in an exhaustive study of the electrical records collected by Lestrade's men. I sat beside him as he compared the data with maps of the city's conduits and power lines, tracing with his long forefinger the flow of current from one station to another. The room was filled with a faint rustle of paper, the hiss of his lamp, and the steady ticking of the mantel clock that had somehow survived the general stoppage. "Observe, Watson," said he at last, his voice low but vibrating with excitement. "The disturbances radiate from a single centre, an unregistered power source somewhere along the Thames between Blackfriars and Southwark. Our adversary has built a nest there, a workshop of some kind. He draws current from the city's grid, amplifies it, and sends it forth through the wires like an invisible tide, a marvel of engineering and the tool of a maniac. You mean to search for it? I asked. Tonight. The tides are low, and the river police, thanks to Lestrade's persuasion, will grant us a boat. If the horologist hides by the water, the Thames shall yield him up before dawn. It was near midnight when we set out from the small pier below Blackfriars Bridge. The fog clung to the water in sluggish folds, muffling every sound save the faint creak of oars. Holmes stood in the bow, his lantern shaded, his keen eyes sweeping the shadowy wharves that lined the southern bank. Beside him sat Lestrade, gruff and alert, and I, armed as always with my service revolver, though uncomfortably aware of how little use it might be against a foe who wielded lightning itself. For a long while we drifted in silence. The current carried us past shuttered warehouses and decaying jetties, where the black water lapped faintly against the timbers. Then, suddenly, Holmes raised his hand. "Backwater there, between those piles. Do you see the faint glow? There, beneath the arch." We rowed closer. From a narrow opening in the embankment issued a thread of light, cold, bluish and intermittent, as though some hidden mechanism pulsed within. The air smelled of ozone. Holmes leapt ashore and motioned us to follow. A low doorway led into a vaulted chamber, once part of an old riverside storehouse. The place hummed with energy. Along the walls, banks of batteries gleamed dully, their copper wires converging upon a single apparatus in the center. A great clockwork contrivance whose pendulum was a rod of polished steel. Its slow oscillation cast flashes of light across the stone. At its base stood a table strewn with papers, diagrams, and tiny watch-like instruments identical to the one Pennington had brought us. Holmes approached cautiously. "Behold, Watson, the heart of the mechanism that silenced a city." Even as he spoke, a voice issued from the shadows. "You admire my handiwork, Mr. Holmes. I confess I take some pleasure in your appreciation." The horologist stepped forward. His manner was calm, his dress impeccable, though the pallor of his face gave him a ghostly aspect. In his hand, he held a small switch connected by wire to the machine. "I knew you would come," he said. "Curiosity is your own form of worship, and you could not resist the altar I have built." Holmes regarded him steadily. "You have committed murder in pursuit of a theory, sir. You have turned science into sorcery and enslaved the truth to vanity. It ends tonight." "Ends?" The horologist smiled faintly. "No, Mr. Holmes. It begins. You of all men should grasp the grandeur of my design. I do not kill for pleasure or profit, but to prove a principle, that time is but a mechanism, and man its engineer. For centuries we have measured it. Now we shall command it." Holmes took a step nearer. "You speak of command while standing within reach of Scotland Yard. Surrender yourself, and you may yet live to continue your experiments within the limits of reason." The other laughed softly. "Reason? You mistake me. When I press this switch, every clock in London will obey. 3:17 shall be eternal. The world will at last perceive the stillness that lies beneath motion." Lestrade sprang forward, but Holmes caught his arm. "Not yet," he whispered. His eyes were fixed upon the oscillating rod. "Note, Watson, the conductor passes through the floor. If we can sever it before the charge is released." But the horologist had already raised his hand. "Farewell, Mr. Holmes." With a sudden leap, Holmes struck the lantern from the table. Darkness swallowed the chamber. There came a blinding flash, hiss of steam and a cry that seemed to echo from the very walls. I flung myself down as sparks showered overhead. When at last the glare subsided, the great machine stood motionless, its pendulum frozen in mid-swing. The smell of burnt metal filled the air. Holmes was upon his feet, his face streaked with soot but triumphant. "The main cable, Watson. I cut it at the instant he moved." We turned to the spot where the horologist had stood. He lay crumpled beside the table, his hands still clutching the severed wire. The expression upon his face was strangely peaceful, as though he had at last entered the silence he so revered. Lestrade bent over him. "He's gone, Mr. Holmes. A clean shock, instantaneous." Holmes regarded the still figure for a moment, then said quietly, "So passes the man who sought to conquer time. In the end, time conquered him." Outside, the first light of dawn crept across the river, and the bells of the city began to chime the hour. One by one their voices rose, soft, measured, alive once more. Holmes stood listening, his profile outlined against the pale glow. "Do you hear them, Watson? The witnesses speak again. London awakens, and the silence is broken." We left the ruined workshop to Lestrade's men and returned to our boat. As we glided downstream, the rising sun struck the water into gold. Holmes sat motionless, his gaze distant. "At last," he murmured, "the current runs true. Yet I wonder, Watson, whether such minds as his are truly extinguished. They burn too fiercely to die outright. Somewhere, in some other age, another will take up the same challenge." He turned to me with a faint smile. "But for the present, my friend, I think London may safely consult its clocks." And as our boat drifted beneath the bridge, the great bell of St. Paul's struck 7, clear, resonant, and wonderfully human. It seemed to me that each note carried not merely the sound of metal upon air, but the living heartbeat of a city restored to motion, and of one man's victory over the stillness that might have silenced it forever. For many weeks following the events on the Thames, London resumed its habitual rhythm, as if the city, shaken but not destroyed, had drawn a deep breath and gone about its business again. The story of the horologist was quickly swallowed by other matters: politics, social scandals, the endless parade of daily trivialities that make up the life of a great metropolis. Only in obscure corners of the press did a few lines mention the discovery of an unlicensed electrical laboratory beneath the river embankment and the tragic death of its mysterious occupant. But for Holmes, the affair did not end so readily. He kept the man's notebooks and devices locked in a small chest near the hearth, which he opened often in those restless days that followed. I would find him seated before the fire, one of the thin volumes spread across his knees, his sharp eyes glinting with the light of the flames. It was plain to me that the strange case had left a mark upon his thoughts deeper than he cared to admit. "I have seen many forms of crime, Watson," said he one evening, "but seldom one so perilously near to genius. The horologist was no mere killer. He was a philosopher whose reasoning had gone mad. He wished to control that which cannot be controlled, time itself. And yet, what was it that drove him to such lengths? A lost faith? A personal grief? I should have liked to know." "You sound almost sympathetic," I remarked. "Sympathy and understanding are not the same," Holmes replied quietly. "To comprehend an adversary is to know the full scope of his evil and, perhaps, of his tragedy. At that moment, there came a sharp knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a letter upon a silver tray. Holmes took it with a frown. "No address upon the seal," he murmured. "Curious. The handwriting is unfamiliar." He broke the envelope and unfolded the paper. As he read, I saw his expression change from mild interest to sudden, taut attention. Without a word, he passed the letter to me. It contained but a single line. "The pendulum has not ceased to swing. Meet me where the city forgets its voice." There was no signature. Holmes rose swiftly, all lethargy gone. "Watson, this handwriting is not the horologist's, but it imitates his manner. There is a second hand in this affair." "Another member of his society?" I ventured. "Undoubtedly. The serpent, as I told you, may have lost its head, but the body still moves. The phrase, 'where the city forgets its voice,' what does that suggest to you?" "Some place silent, I suppose. A church, perhaps. Or a graveyard," he said grimly. "Come, Watson, we shall start with the obvious." By nightfall, we were making our way through the fog-wrapped lanes of Highgate, where the ancient cemetery stretched like a city of the dead beneath the trees. The air was chill and damp, and the narrow paths wound between leaning stones and moss-grown angels. Our lanterns cast long, wavering shadows across the monuments. "Observe," Holmes whispered, pointing to a faint glow among the tombs. "Someone waits for us there." We approached with caution. A solitary figure stood beside a crumbling mausoleum, a lantern in one hand and a walking stick in the other. He turned as we drew near, revealing a thin, bearded face, one I instantly recognized. "Good heavens," I cried. "Pennington!" The young man looked older, his eyes hollow, his expression haunted. "Mr. Holmes," he said hoarsely, "I had to see you. I could not rest until I told you the truth." Holmes regarded him keenly. "You were wise to come. Speak quickly. What truth?" "It was not over," Pennington said. "After the horologist died, I thought the danger ended. But last week I received a message. No name, only the sign of the triangle. It told me to come here, to finish what he began. I swear I had no part in it, but others did. There were men in the society who escaped the police. They mean to build another synchronizer, one that will reach beyond London. I have seen the designs. They meet beneath the city, in the catacombs of the old post tunnels." Holmes's face darkened. "The fools! To revive that infernal scheme after all that has happened, it is madness." Before he could question the man further, there came a rustle among the trees. A shadow moved, swift and silent. Pennington cried out and stumbled backward. A sharp report split the night. He fell without a sound. I dropped beside him, but the wound was mortal. Holmes darted toward the darkness, revolver in hand, and fired twice. A fleeting silhouette vanished among the stones, leaving only the echo of footsteps. When he returned, his expression was grim. Gone, but not without leaving his mark. He stooped and picked up a small object from the ground. It was a brass disc, no larger than a coin, engraved with the familiar emblem of the clock without hands. "Another of their cursed tokens," he muttered. "Watson, help me lift him. The man is beyond aid, but his death confirms the truth of his words. The city of silent witnesses rises again." We carried Pennington's body to the gatekeeper's lodge and summoned the police. Lestrade arrived within the hour, his face pale with disbelief. "You mean to say there's another gang?" he asked. "Not a gang, an inheritance," Holmes replied. The horologist's disciples continue his work, perhaps believing themselves his avengers. The note I received was a summons, and this meeting was meant to silence our informant. They will move quickly now, fearing discovery. Back at Baker Street, Holmes spread the letter and the brass disc upon the table. His eyes burned with new intensity. "A network beneath the city," he murmured. "Those old post tunnels run for miles beneath London, forgotten by most. If they have made their lair there, they can strike unseen." He rose and began pacing. "We must descend into that underworld, Watson. It is there that the final act will play out." I confess I shivered at his words, though my resolve was firm. "When?" "Tomorrow night. There is no time to lose. They have already killed once to protect their secret. They will kill again before they are done. But I mean to end this where it began, in silence." He stopped before the window, looking out into the mist-veiled city. The lamplight gleamed on the instruments upon the table. Compasses, wires, magnifiers, tools of his trade and of his restless mind. "Watson," he said softly, "have you ever noticed how London breathes? By day it roars, by night it murmurs. But beneath its pavements there is another London, cold, patient, eternal. That is where we go tomorrow, into the city of shadows, where time itself has no dominion." He turned back, his eyes alight with the fierce, familiar fire of pursuit. "Pack your revolver, my dear fellow. The clocks of London may yet fall silent again, but not while Sherlock Holmes lives to hear them tick." The following evening found us standing upon the desolate expanse of the old postal yard near Holborn, where the mouth of one of London's forgotten arteries gaped black and damp beneath a half-ruined archway. Few in the city now recalled that a subterranean railway had once carried the mail beneath their feet, a network of narrow tunnels long abandoned to decay. It was there, Holmes had determined, that the surviving members of the City of Silent Witnesses had taken refuge. The air was cold, the fog heavy with soot. Lestrade waited with half a dozen plainclothesmen, each armed and grim-faced. Holmes, wrapped in his grey ulster, carried only his lantern and revolver. I observed that he was unusually pale, though his eyes burned with an inner brightness that was almost feverish. "Watson," he said quietly, "this descent will be unpleasant, but it must be made. I cannot leave these men free to repeat the madness of their master. If they complete their new device, it will not be a single building or quarter of the city that stops. It will be all of London. They call themselves Silent Witnesses. Tonight, we shall let them speak to the law." With that, he led the way down the iron ladder into the darkness below. The stale air of the tunnel rose to meet us, foul with the smell of rust and damp clay. Our lanterns cast dim, wavering circles upon the walls. The sound of our boots echoed faintly along the curved passage, mingling with the distant drip of unseen water. For more than a quarter of a mile, we advanced in silence. At length, Holmes raised his hand. "Listen," he whispered. From far ahead came a faint, rhythmic vibration, metal upon metal, deliberate and mechanical. We extinguished all but one lamp and moved forward with utmost caution. Soon, a glow appeared, flickering from a side chamber whose half-open door revealed a scene both extraordinary and sinister. Within, a group of 5 men labored around a complex framework of copper coils and glass tubes. The machine, larger than any we had yet seen, was clearly unfinished, but the energy humming through it was unmistakable. The air shimmered faintly, and the hair upon my hands stood erect from the static charge. Upon a table beside them lay drawings and charts covered with mathematical symbols. One of the men, the eldest, his head bald and gleaming, seemed to direct the others with curt gestures. Holmes bent close to me. "That must be Redding," he murmured. "He was Bartholdi's engineer. I should have guessed he survived. The fool means to perfect his master's legacy." He motioned to Lestrade, who signaled his men to spread out. Then, with the sudden precision of a spring uncoiling, Holmes stepped into the chamber, his revolver raised. "Gentlemen," he said in a voice of cold authority, "the experiment is concluded. I suggest you put down your tools." For a moment, the men froze in astonishment. Then Redding turned sharply, his face contorted with fury. "Holmes, you meddler! Do you think you can stop what is already begun?" He seized a lever upon the machine. Holmes fired, the bullet striking the mechanism with a flash of sparks. The chamber filled with a hiss like escaping steam, and the lamps flickered wildly. Lestrade's men rushed in, grappling with the conspirators. I caught sight of one man attempting to flee through a side passage and fired, striking the wall beside him. He dropped his weapon and surrendered. In less than a minute, the struggle was over. 3 of the men lay bound, another stunned, and Redding himself pinned against the wall by 2 constables. The machine still glowed faintly, its pendulum vibrating with a life of its own. "Careful!" Holmes cried. "The circuit is not broken. Lestrade, keep everyone clear." He bent over the apparatus, his face drawn with concentration. "It is worse than I feared," he muttered. "This device would amplify a single impulse through every telegraph line in the kingdom. The horologist's dream, resurrected and magnified." Redding laughed harshly. "You call it a dream, but it is destiny. When I throw that switch, the clocks of the world will stop, and mankind will remember me." Holmes straightened, his revolver steady. "If you move 1 inch toward that switch, you will not live to see your legacy," he said evenly. The man hesitated, eyes darting between Holmes and the machine. Then, with a sudden convulsive movement, he wrenched free from his captors and hurled himself toward the controls. Holmes fired again. Redding fell forward, striking the panel. There was a sharp crack of electricity, a burst of blue light, and the great machine went dead. For an instant there was silence. Then Holmes exhaled slowly. "It is finished," he said. "No more will London tremble to the heartbeat of madness." Lestrade approached, shaking his head. "By heaven, Mr. Holmes, you've saved us all again. I'll not pretend to understand half of it, but the Yard owes you another debt." Holmes smiled faintly, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Pay it by keeping this business out of the public prints. The world has little need to know how near it came to darkness." We left the prisoners to the police and began our ascent to the surface. The chill air of night struck our faces like a benediction. Above, the city stretched silent and immense, unaware of how narrowly it had escaped paralysis. Holmes stood for a moment, looking eastward, where the first faint glimmer of dawn touched the spires. "Watson," he said at last, "do you know what I find most remarkable? Not that such men exist, for they always will, but that the world endures them with such composure. The city sleeps, the sun rises, the clocks tick on, and no one imagines the battles fought in their defense." "You speak as if weary," I said. He gave a short laugh. Perhaps I am. There is a fatigue that comes not from the body, but from the mind, from dwelling too long among schemes that twist genius into destruction. Yet, he drew a deep breath. There is solace in victory. Come, my friend. Mrs. Hudson's breakfast will be a welcome proof that time, for once, is on our side. We hailed a cab and drove westward through the awakening streets. The milkmen were abroad, and the first papers of the day rustled upon the doorsteps. It struck me, as I watched the pale light brighten over the rooftops, that Holmes's battles, like those of the unseen city below, were waged not for glory, but for the simple continuation of life as it should be lived. As we passed beneath the clock tower at Westminster, its great bell tolled the hour, deep, deliberate, serene. Holmes looked up, a rare expression of peace softening his features. "Listen, Watson," he said quietly. "There it is again, the city's heart beating in its proper time. Long may it do so." And thus ended, as it seemed, the last chapter of the City of Silent Witnesses. But in the small hours when the lamps burned low and the streets were empty, I sometimes saw Holmes at his desk, turning once more the pages of the horologist's notes. His face in the lamplight was thoughtful, almost wistful, as though he alone could hear a faint ticking beyond the reach of mortal ears. The sound of a mystery not yet entirely silenced by the triumph of reason. A month had passed since the final descent into the tunnels beneath Holborn. Yet, even as spring crept hesitantly into the streets of London, a shadow lingered over Baker Street. Holmes had resumed his customary routine, his chemical experiments, his violin, and the endless flood of correspondences from those seeking his counsel. But I could see that his thoughts were not wholly his own. There was a quality of abstraction in his gaze when he spoke, and more than once I caught him staring at the small brass disc that lay upon the mantel, the symbol of the clock without hands. It was on an overcast afternoon that the quiet was broken by a most unexpected visitor. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a gentleman of striking appearance, tall, severe, dressed in black from collar to cuff, his manner one of cold self-possession. He bowed slightly. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes." Holmes inclined his head. "At your service." "My name," said the stranger, "is Dr. Erasmus Woyman. I am attached to the physical laboratory at King's College. You may have read my papers on the conductivity of precious metals." "I have indeed," said Holmes. "Your experiments upon vibratory current were most ingenious. I congratulate you." The man's expression did not change. "I come to you upon a matter that may bear relation to your recent investigations. A shipment of experimental apparatus, coils, galvanic cells, and certain refined alloys has disappeared from my laboratory. The theft was discovered only this morning. The night watchman was found unconscious beside a broken fuse box. The clock in the laboratory stopped at exactly 3:17. Holmes was on his feet in an instant. 3:17, he repeated. "The hour returns, Watson, the signature of the silent witnesses. Pray, Dr. Wyman, continue." "There is little else to tell," said the scientist with a slight shrug. "The materials are of considerable value to my work, but to none other, unless the thief possessed an understanding equal to my own. I had assumed it to be a simple robbery until I observed the clock." Holmes's eyes flashed. "You were wise to come. This is no common theft. You say the watchman lives?" "He does, though disoriented. He insists he saw a light, a bluish glow, and heard a sound like the humming of 1,000 bees. After that, he remembers nothing. Holmes turned to me. "Watson, fetch your coat. Lestrade must be informed at once. The ashes of the city of silent witnesses are smouldering again." Within the hour, we were at the laboratory, a tall building of soot-darkened brick overlooking the Strand. Dr. Wyman led us through a long corridor lined with cabinets of scientific instruments until we came to the main chamber. It was a curious place, half workshop, half shrine, filled with copper coils, batteries, and gleaming lenses. The clock above the doorway stood frozen at the fatal minute. Holmes moved from bench to bench, examining every trace with his lens. "See here, Watson," he said, pointing to a blackened mark upon the floor. "A high discharge has passed through this spot. The thief employed an induction coil of great power, perhaps one of Wyman's own design. Notice also the footprint, half burned into the dust. Narrow instep, sharp heel, a foreign-made boot. These men are organized again." Lestrade arrived shortly afterward, red-faced and skeptical as ever. "You're not telling me, Mr. Holmes, that these time-stopping gentlemen have risen from the grave?" "I tell you only that their work has been resumed," Holmes replied. "Whether by new hands or old, I cannot yet say. But we are dealing with a mind of science, not of crime. Whoever leads them now has knowledge enough to complete what the horologist began." He turned to Wyman. "Did you speak of your experiments to anyone outside the college?" The scientist frowned. "To no one, except a colleague who assisted me last year, Professor Julius Hartmann, an engineer of some ability. He left England 6 months ago to accept a post in Germany." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "And has he written to you since?" "Only once, a brief note of farewell. Why do you ask?" "Because," said Holmes quietly, "I believe your colleague never left England at all." We left the college as dusk fell. Holmes was silent during our drive back to Baker Street, his face set in those lines of profound thought I had learned not to disturb. Only when the lamps were lit and he had flung himself into his armchair did he speak. "Watson," said he, "Dr. Wyman's missing colleague is our new adversary. Consider, a trained engineer, conversant with electrical theory, vanishing just as the remnants of the city scatter. The materials stolen today were precisely those required to rebuild a synchronizer, only on a far greater scale. Hartmann has inherited the horologist's dream." I ventured that perhaps he was mistaken, but Holmes shook his head impatiently. No, the pattern is clear. 3:17, the moment of perfect equilibrium between pulse and current. The horologist chose it as symbol and signature, but Hartmann means to make it literal. If he succeeds, the electrical rhythm of the city will halt for good. We must find his hiding place. He rose and began pacing, his fingers interlaced behind his back. Where would a man of science and secrecy construct such an apparatus? Somewhere remote, yet close to the lines of power he requires. Not underground, the yard will have sealed the tunnels. Not in the heart of London, too visible. No, he will choose a site upon the outskirts, near the river perhaps, where machinery may work unheard. He stopped suddenly. "Watson, how far does the electric telegraph run beyond the city?" "As far as Greenwich," I replied. "Exactly," cried Holmes. "Greenwich, the home of time itself. What place more fitting for a man who would command the clocks of England?" He snatched a map from the wall and spread it upon the table. See here, the disused observatory workshops by the river, abandoned since the installation of the new meridian instruments. They stand upon an isolated quay, and the main telegraph cable passes within yards of them. Hartmann could not resist so symbolic a location. Then you mean to go there? Tomorrow night, Lestrade shall accompany us with his men. If my reasoning is sound, we shall catch the last of the silent witnesses in the act of silencing time itself. He leaned back, his expression thoughtful. Strange, is it not, Watson? The more I study these men, the more I see in them a distorted reflection of myself. Their logic is perfect, only their morality is missing. Were I to lose that compass, I might have walked the same path. I protested, but he smiled faintly and waved a hand. Come, come, let us not moralize. There will be work enough tomorrow to occupy both conscience and intellect. That night, as I retired, I could hear him still moving about the sitting room, testing some small electrical device of his own design. At intervals, a faint spark flashed against the dark, and the click of a clock's mechanism was followed by its chime. The next morning, London woke beneath a pall of mist. The bells of St. Paul's sounded dim and distant through the haze, and I could not help but wonder if, before many hours had passed, they would be silenced once more. Holmes greeted me with his customary composure, his overcoat already buttoned and his revolver loaded. "Watson," said he, "today we stand at the meridian between order and chaos. Let us hope that when the clock strikes 3:17 again, it will be London that keeps the time, and not our enemy." The morning was dull and heavy, a mist pressing low upon the streets when Holmes and I set out toward Greenwich. London seemed subdued beneath that grey sky, the air charged with an invisible tension that neither of us could quite name. Holmes, ever alert to the smallest sign, sat forward in the cab, his keen eyes fixed upon the river's sluggish flow. At his request, Lestrade and two of his men followed in another conveyance, maintaining a discreet distance. We spoke little during the drive. Holmes's mind, I could see, was wholly absorbed in the coming confrontation. Every so often he would take out his watch, check the time, and then glance at the skyline as though measuring some unspoken rhythm against it. By the time we reached Greenwich, the fog had begun to lift, revealing the outlines of the old observatory buildings upon the hill. Beyond them lay the disused workshops of which Holmes had spoken. Long, low structures of iron and brick, their windows boarded, their chimneys cold. The place appeared abandoned, but as we approached, a faint hum reached my ears, a sound like the breathing of a machine. Holmes held up his hand. "There," he whispered. "Do you hear it? That is no idle wind through the wires. The current flows within." He motioned for silence and crept toward a narrow side door whose lock showed recent marks of tampering. Producing a thin blade from his pocket, he worked the mechanism with practiced ease, and in a moment we were inside. The air was warm, metallic, and tinged with ozone. Before us stretched a vast chamber filled with apparatus, coils, dynamos, batteries, and gears, arranged in a pattern so intricate that it resembled a cathedral built of copper and glass. At its center stood a towering frame supporting a pendulum of pure steel that swung slowly back and forth, sending faint vibrations through the floor. Holmes drew in his breath. The synchronizer perfected. Hartman has done what his master could not. At that instant, a voice echoed through the hall. You are observant as ever, Mr. Holmes. From behind the central machine stepped a man in a dark coat, his features sharp and ascetic, his hair streaked with iron grey. His eyes, though cold, held the unmistakable gleam of intellect. Professor Julius Hartman, I presume, said Holmes. The man inclined his head slightly. At your service, though I fear you come too late. You destroyed the horologist's dream, but I have given it new life. When this pendulum reaches its full arc, every electrical pulse in London will harmonize. The clocks, the telegraphs, even the heartbeat of the city will pause as one. A single moment of silence, Mr. Holmes, a proof of absolute control. Holmes stepped forward, revolver in hand. Control over death, perhaps, but not over justice. Switch off your machine, or I swear by heaven I shall stop it for you. Hartman smiled faintly. You cannot frighten me. I stand upon the threshold of a new science. The horologist sought only mastery. I seek transcendence. When time itself kneels, I shall... A shot rang out. The bullet shattered a glass tube beside him, and a hiss of steam filled the air. Lestrade and his men had entered by the opposite door. In the confusion that followed, Hartman darted behind the machine, striking a lever as he went. The great pendulum quickened its motion, its swing becoming a blur of light. Back! Holmes shouted. He's overloading the circuit. A violent crackling filled the air, and the floor seemed to tremble beneath our feet. Sparks leapt from the dynamos. The smell of burning insulation stung the nostrils. I saw Holmes run to the nearest console, wrenching free a coil of wire. Watson, the main feed. Sever it, man, or London will burn. I seized an iron bar and brought it down upon the cable. There was a blinding flash, a cry of pain, and the pendulum froze mid-swing. Smoke rose from the machinery, and a strange stillness settled over the hall. When my sight cleared, I beheld Holmes standing amid the wreckage, his face pale but resolute. At his feet lay Hartman, stunned but alive, his hands still clenched around the shattered remains of the control lever. It's over, said Lestrade, stepping forward to secure the prisoner. By heaven, Mr. Holmes, I thought we were all done for. Holmes made no reply. He was staring at the pendulum, now motionless, its mirror-smooth surface reflecting the pale morning light that seeped through the broken windows. Observe, Watson, he said quietly. The thing he built to rule time has itself been stilled. There is a certain poetic symmetry in that. Hartman groaned as Lestrade's men lifted him. You fools, he muttered. You have destroyed perfection. For one instant, I held eternity in my grasp. Holmes bent over him. You held only a delusion, Professor. Time is not yours to command. It is your judge, as it is mine, as it is every man's. Be grateful that the law, not the current, will deliver your punishment. We left the ruined workshop as the first rays of sunlight pierced the mist. Outside, the bells of Greenwich began to strike the hour, their tones bright and resolute. Holmes paused to listen, his expression softening. Do you hear, Watson? The voice of time restored to harmony. It is not silence that proves order. It is motion. London lives because it moves. Lestrade approached, rubbing his hands together. The Yard will have a tidy report to write tonight. I suppose you'll want no mention of these infernal machines in the papers. Holmes smiled thinly. Let the city dream its ordinary dreams, Inspector. The people need not know how near they came to an eternal pause. As we drove back through the awakening streets, the sky cleared, revealing the silver sheen of the river. Holmes sat deep in thought, his long fingers interlaced, his gaze fixed upon the horizon. After a long silence, he spoke. "Watson, we have pursued this spectre through its many disguises. The horologist, Bartholdi, Redding, and now Hartmann. Each sought mastery, yet each in the end became servant to the same conceit. There is a lesson in it, though not for them. To seek absolute control over time is to lose one's place within it." I nodded. "Then the affair is truly ended?" "For now," he said, with that familiar glint of irony. "But time is a wheel, my dear fellow. It turns again and again, and the same designs recur upon its rim. Somewhere, another mind will listen to the ticking of a clock and dream of silence." He leaned back and closed his eyes, the faintest smile upon his lips. "Let us hope, when that day comes, there will still be someone awake to hear it." And so, as the cab rattled toward Baker Street and the sun broke fully through the haze, I reflected that once more the restless mind of Sherlock Holmes had preserved the city from peril, its streets alive, its bells unbroken, and its eternal heart still beating to the measure of time. The following days passed in a quiet that felt almost unnatural after the thunderous climax of events at Greenwich. The newspapers made mention of a mysterious explosion in one of the old observatory workshops, and that a foreign scientist had been taken into custody on suspicion of tampering with government property. Of the true story, of the last echo of the city of silent witnesses, the world remained blissfully unaware. Holmes, as ever, had already turned his mind to other things. Yet, in the intervals between his chemical experiments and the habitual smoke-wreathed silences, I could see that the affair had left a deeper impression upon him than he would readily admit. His movements were restless. His moods alternated between fierce energy and long spells of brooding reflection. One evening, as the rain beat softly against the windows, I found him seated in his armchair, the firelight throwing quick shadows across his sharp features. On the table before him lay the familiar brass disc, the emblem of the clock without hands, taken from Hartmann's workshop. He turned it over between his fingers, studying it with a melancholy expression. "Watson," said he at last, "do you know what troubles me about this case?" "That we nearly lost our lives?" I suggested. He smiled faintly. "No, my dear fellow, not that. Danger is the air I breathe. It is the curious thought that, in some obscure way, I have been contending not with men alone, but with an idea. Each of those we unmasked, the jeweller Hargreaves's apprentice, Bartholdi, Redding, Hartmann, was driven by the same conviction, that order and control could be perfected if only time could be bent to the will. They failed, of course, but I cannot help wondering whether the next mind that takes up that notion will be wiser, subtler, and less easily thwarted." "Then you fear a return of this cult?" He shrugged. "Ideas are like seeds, Watson. Once sown, they may lie dormant for years, awaiting the proper season to bloom again. But enough philosophy. We have work to do, and Mrs. Hudson will have my hide if we ruin another carpet with chemical stains." He rose abruptly and went to his table, where an open telegram lay among his retorts and test tubes. "A message from Lestrade," he said. "Our friend Hartman has confessed. It seems he truly believed he could suspend the very pulse of the world. He was no common villain, merely another tragic instance of intellect divorced from conscience." I read the telegram over his shoulder. "He speaks of a journal," I noted. "A final record of his experiments." Holmes nodded. "Yes, it was recovered from the wreckage. I have seen it. A remarkable document, though filled with a logic so twisted that it reads like the ravings of a poet possessed. Still, I have arranged for it to be sealed in the archives at the Yard. No good could come of such knowledge." He placed the disc upon the mantel, then turned to me with a sudden brightness. "Come, Watson, I have been too long indoors. A walk will do us both good. The fog has lifted, and London, after all her alarms, is herself again." We stepped out into Baker Street, where the lamps shone softly through a fine mist. The familiar bustle of the evening crowd was all around us. Omnibuses rattling past, newspaper boys shouting the latest headlines, and the endless stream of footsteps upon the wet pavement. To anyone else, it was the same city as before, but to me, it seemed subtly changed. The clang of a distant bell, the glint of a watch chain under a street lamp, each recalled the strange battle we had fought to preserve those ordinary sounds and sights. As we walked, Holmes fell into one of his long silences, his gaze fixed ahead. Presently, he said, "It is an odd thing, Watson, how easily the world continues. Remove one man, destroy one machine, and by morning the newsboys still cry the hour, the trains still run upon their timetables, and lovers still arrange their meetings beneath the same unthinking clock faces. That, I suppose, is civilization, the persistence of habit in the face of chaos." "I should say it is providence," I ventured. "Call it what you will," he answered, smiling. "But it comforts me to think that no hand, however cunning, can hold back the tide for long." We turned down toward the Strand, where the lights of the theatres gleamed through the fog. For the first time in many weeks, Holmes appeared content. Yet as we passed a shop window displaying watches and chronometers, he slowed, and his eyes lingered on the delicate rows of faces, each marking its own relentless progress through time. "I confess," he said softly, "that I find something almost human in them, Watson. Each of those tiny mechanisms ticking away in patient obedience, unaware of the great dramas they measure. Perhaps it is we, not they, who are the true instruments of time." Before I could reply, a familiar voice hailed us from the curb. It was Lestrade, hurrying toward us through the drizzle, his overcoat flapping about his legs. "Evening, Mr. Holmes. Doctor, you'll be glad to hear Hartman's people have been rounded up, the last of the gang. No more ticking devils for us, eh?" Holmes inclined his head. "Excellent news, Inspector. London owes you more than it knows." Lestrade grinned, rubbing his hands. "And perhaps now you'll take a holiday, Mr. Holmes. There's talk in the Yard that you never rest." "A holiday?" Holmes repeated. "My dear Lestrade, when men like Hartman exist, how can one rest? Crime does not take holidays." Lestrade laughed, tipped his hat, and vanished into the fog. We resumed our walk, and Holmes's mood lightened once more. By the time we reached the corner of Marylebone Road, he had launched into an animated monologue upon the relative merits of deduction and intuition, and it seemed as though the recent horrors had been swept entirely from his mind. Yet that night, long after I had gone to my room, I was awakened by a faint rhythmic sound from the sitting room below. Rising and descending in steady cadence, it might have been the pendulum of a clock, yet there was no clock in Baker Street that ticked with such deep and solemn measure. I crept to the door and looked in. Holmes sat alone by the fire, the brass disc upon his palm, his eyes fixed upon the mantel clock. Each time it ticked, he gave a slight nod, as though keeping time with some private calculation. After a long while, he sighed, placed the disc in the drawer of his desk, and rose to extinguish the lamp. "Sleep well, old friend," I heard him murmur to the city beyond the window. "You have earned your silence." The sound of the clock continued for a moment, then faded as he turned the key. And thus ended the affair that men later called the City of Silent Witnesses, a tale of intellect corrupted and time defied, in which my friend once more proved that no design, however subtle, could outpace the reasoning of Sherlock Holmes. In the months that followed, life at Baker Street resumed its familiar rhythm. New mysteries arose, new puzzles to engage that extraordinary mind, and the dark memory of the horologist receded into the mists of London legend. Yet sometimes, when the streets fall still and the last carriage has passed, I think I hear it again, the faint, ghostly tick of a clock long stopped, reminding me that even in silence, time bears witness.